Elena Castillo sat hunched over her laptop in her cramped Seattle apartment, the glow of the screen casting shadows across her face. Rain tapped relentlessly against the window, a gray curtain blurring the world outside. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating as she stared at the latest invoice from the bank. Another reminder that her photography studio, Loose Natural, was drowning in debt. 3 years of pouring her heart into capturing fleeting moments, golden sunsets, quiet smiles, the raw beauty of the Pacific Northwest, might end with a foreclosure notice. She rubbed her eyes, glancing at the clock. Almost 6. Mateo would be home soon from his part-time job at the coffee shop, his tired grin hiding the exhaustion of living with a heart condition they couldn't afford to fix. At 19, her little brother deserved more than a leaky apartment and a sister who couldn't keep the lights on. Elena sighed, pushing a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "Come on, Elle," she muttered to herself. Good gig, that's all we need." The phone buzzed on the table, jolting her out of her thoughts. Unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. Probably another debt collector. But something made her swipe the screen. "Hello?" Her voice came out rougher than she meant it to. "Miss Elena Castillo?" The man on the other end sounded polished, like he spent his days in boardrooms instead of rainy apartments. "This is Charles Langston with Langston and Pierce in San Francisco. I'm calling regarding the estate of Edward Kessler." Elena frowned, leaning back in her chair. "I'm sorry, I think you've got the wrong person. I don't know an Edward Kessler." "There's no mistake," Charles said, his tone unwavering. "According to our records, you're listed as the fiancé of Julian Kessler, Edward's son and the CEO of Kessler Green Tech. We need your presence at the reading of the will in San Francisco next week." The words hit her like a splash of cold water. "Fiancé? Of a CEO? I've never even heard of this guy." She laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. "This has to be some kind of mix-up." "Ms. Castillo, I assure you the details have been verified. First-class tickets and accommodations at the Fairmont are already arranged. I'll send you the itinerary shortly." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Given the significance of the estate, your attendance is critical." The line went dead before she could argue. Elena stared at the phone, her pulse racing. Out the window, rain streaked the glass like tears, and she caught her reflection. Wide brown eyes. A face that hadn't slept well in months. "Who mistakes me for a millionaire's fiancé?" she whispered, half amused, half terrified. Her inbox pinged. An email from Charles Langston, complete with flight details and a hotel confirmation. She opened it, skimming the words, "Kessler Green Tech, Julian Kessler, estate valued in the billions." Her stomach twisted. This was insane. She should call back, tell them they'd screwed up, laugh it off. But then her eyes drifted to Mateo's worn sneakers by the door, the stack of medical bills on the counter, the eviction notice pinned under a coffee mug. She tapped her fingers on the table, the rain's rhythm matching her thoughts. Maybe this was a mistake. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a lifeline. San Francisco was only a flight away. What did she have to lose? Elena stepped off the plane in San Francisco, her worn camera bag slung over her shoulder and a knot tightening in her chest. The airport buzzed with people. Businessmen in sharp suits, tourists snapping selfies, but she felt like she'd wandered into someone else's life. The first-class ticket had been real, the driver holding a sign with her name even more surreal. Now, as the sleek black car wove through the city's steep streets, she stared out at the gleaming skyline, wondering what she'd gotten herself into. The car pulled up to a towering glass building, its facade reflecting the late afternoon sun. Kessler Green Tech was etched in elegant letters above the entrance. Elena adjusted her jacket, a thrift store find that suddenly felt too casual, and followed the driver inside. The lobby smelled faintly of eucalyptus, all polished marble and minimalist furniture. A receptionist with a flawless smile ushered her to the top floor. When the elevator doors slid open, she found herself in an office that could have doubled as an art gallery. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a view of the bay, golden light spilling across a desk cluttered with blueprints and tech gadgets. And there, standing by the window, was Julian Kessler. He turned as she stepped in, and Alina's breath caught for a second. At 35, he wasn't what she'd expected from a millionaire CEO. No slick arrogance or flashy watch. His dark hair was slightly mussed, his button-down rolled up at the sleeves, revealing forearms that suggested he didn't spend all his time behind a desk. His hazel eyes met hers, steady and unreadable. "Miss Castillo," he said, his voice low and warm, like he was greeting an old friend. "Thank you for coming." "I'm still not sure why I'm here," she replied, clutching her bag tighter. "Your lawyer's got me pegged as your fiancé, which is news to me." Julian gestured to a leather chair across from his desk. "Please, sit. I owe you an explanation." She hesitated, then sank into the seat, watching as he settled into his own. He leaned forward, hands clasped, and she noticed a faint scar across his knuckles, oddly human for a man who ran a billion-dollar company. "My father passed away 6 months ago," he began. "He built Kessler Green Tech from nothing. Sustainable tech, clean energy, a legacy to leave the world better than he found it. His will stipulates that I have to be married by my next birthday to keep control of the company. If I don't, it goes to my cousin Vanessa." Elena raised an eyebrow. "And Vanessa's the bad guy? She'd sell us out to the highest bidder, oil companies, tech giants who don't care about the mission. Everything my father worked for would be gutted." He paused, his gaze flickering to the window. "I've got 3 months left. I need a fiancé, someone believable, to satisfy the board and the will." She crossed her arms. "And you picked me? Some random photographer from Seattle? That's a stretch even for a desperate plan." "It's not random." Julian reached into a drawer and pulled out a thin folder, sliding it across the desk. Elena flipped it open, her stomach dropping as she saw her own work, prints of her photos, a misty forest, a child laughing in the rain, a close-up of Mateo's hands holding a coffee cup. "I've seen your portfolio online," he said. "Your posts about keeping your studio alive, about your brother's surgery. You're real. You fight for what matters." Her fingers tightened on the folder. "So you stalked me?" "I researched," he corrected, his tone calm but firm. "I needed someone the board wouldn't question. Someone with heart, not just a hired actress. And then, the mix-up with my father's estate happened. Your name came up by mistake, and it felt serendipitous." Alina laughed, sharp and bitter. "Serendipitous? This isn't a rom-com, Mr. Kessler. This is my life." "Julian," he said softly. "Call me Julian." He leaned back, studying her. 3 months. That's all I'm asking. You play the part, public appearances, a few events, nothing more. In return, I'll pay you $3 million. Enough to save your studio, get Mateo's surgery, start over. The number hit her like a punch. 3 million. She pictured Mateo breathing easier, the studio's lights staying on, a future where she wasn't drowning. But something twisted inside her. Pride, maybe, or the nagging voice that said this was wrong. "I don't do lies," she said, her voice quieter now. "I capture truth for a living." "I know." Julian stood and walked around the desk, stopping just close enough that she could smell his cologne, something woody and faint. He looked down at her, his eyes locking with hers, and there was a softness there that threw her off. "I need you, Elena. Not just anyone. You. I can't do this without someone I trust." Her heart thudded. Trust? He didn't even know her, but the way he said it, the way he held her gaze made her feel seen, like he'd peered through her lens and found something she didn't even know was there. She thought of Mateo's tired smile, The eviction notice waiting back home. 3 months. 3 million. A lie for a lifeline. What exactly would I have to do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian's lips curved, just a hint of relief breaking through. We'd figure it out together, starting tomorrow, if you say yes. She swallowed hard, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. The rain might have been miles away in Seattle, but she felt it here, soaking through her resolve. Okay, she said finally, the word tasting strange on her tongue. I'm in. His eyes softened, and for a moment she wondered what she'd just agreed to. Not just the deal, but the man standing in front of her, watching her like she was the only thing in the room that mattered. Elena's first week in San Francisco felt like stepping into a stranger's skin. She'd packed her camera, a few favorite lenses, and a suitcase of clothes that didn't quite match the glossy world she was entering. Julian had set her up in a guest suite at his penthouse, a sprawling place with views of the Golden Gate Bridge and walls lined with abstract art. She'd half expected gold faucets and champagne fountains, but it was simpler than that. Hardwood floors, a cozy armchair, a shelf stuffed with photography books. Still, it wasn't her rainy Seattle apartment, and she felt the difference every time she woke up to sunlight instead of drizzle. They started building the lie that first evening, sitting across from each other at his kitchen island with takeout Thai food and a notepad. We need a story, Julian said, twirling a pen between his fingers. Something the board and Vanessa can't poke holes through. Elena picked at her pad Thai, her stomach too knotted to eat much. Okay, so how'd we meet? I'm not exactly the type to crash tech galas. He smiled, a small, genuine one that crinkled the corners of his eyes. What about the Portland Photo Expo? 6 months ago. You had a booth there. Landscapes, right? She nodded, surprised he knew. Yeah, I showed some shots from the Cascades. You were there? I was. He flipped open a leather-bound notebook, revealing pages of scribbled notes. Angles, lighting tips, names of photographers. I stopped by your table. You were talking to some kid about how to frame a sunset. I didn't say hi, but I remembered you. Ella's cheeks warmed. She vaguely recalled that day. Crowds, coffee stains on her shirt, a blur of faces. So you're saying you fell for me at first sight? She teased, trying to lighten the tension. Something like that. His tone was playful, but his eyes lingered on her a beat too long. Let's say I saw your work, asked you out for coffee after. One thing led to another. Coffee's believable, she said, scribbling it down. What's our first date? Dinner at a little Italian place in North Beach. Quiet, low-key. You wore that green sweater you've got in your bag. He nodded toward her suitcase in the corner, and she laughed, caught off guard. You're observant, she said. Creepy, but observant. Part of the job. He shrugged, but there was a flicker of something, pride maybe, in his expression. We've been dating long distance since, kept it quiet until now. They spent hours refining it. How he'd call her late at night to talk about her latest shoots. How she'd send him prints of her work. They practiced the little things too. How to stand close without it feeling forced. How to brush hands like it was second nature. By the third night, she could almost believe it herself. The way his fingers grazed hers when he passed her a glass of water. The way he'd tilt his head when she rambled about aperture settings. But it wasn't all smooth. Vanessa showed up unannounced on day 5, striding into the penthouse like she owned it. She was tall, sharp-edged, her blonde hair pulled back tight enough to match her smile. So, this is the mystery girl, she said, eyeing Elena like she was a smudge on a lens. Julian's never mentioned you. Funny, considering we talk every week. Elena straightened, channeling the calm she used with difficult clients. Elena Castillo, she said, offering a hand. I've heard plenty about you. Really? Vanessa's handshake was cold, her gaze colder. Because I've heard nothing about you. Care to enlighten me? Julian stepped in, his hand resting lightly on Elena's shoulder, a move they'd rehearsed. "We've been keeping it private," he said, his voice steady but edged with warning. "Didn't want the rumor mill spinning before we were ready." Vanessa's eyes narrowed, flicking between them. "Private? How convenient." She crossed her arms. "The board's meeting next week, Julian. They'll want to meet her. Hope your story holds up." After she left, Elena sank onto the couch, her pulse still racing. "She's intense." "She's a shark," Julian muttered, pouring himself a glass of bourbon. "Always has been. We need to be flawless, every look, every word." "Then let's practice," she said, determined. "What's next on the fiancé checklist?" He set the glass down and pulled out his phone, scrolling to a photo, a blurry shot of her at the Portland Expo, adjusting her camera. "This," he said quietly. "I took it that day. Didn't know why I kept it until now." Elena stared at the image, her throat tightening. She remembered that moment, fumbling with her tripod, cursing under her breath. "Why didn't you say hi?" "Didn't think I'd get the chance to later." He met her eyes, and there was something raw there, unguarded. "Guess I was wrong." She looked away, heat creeping up her neck. "Okay, so you're the sentimental type. Good detail for the story." She forced a laugh, but it sounded shaky even to her. "What's our next move?" "Public debut," he said, tucking the phone away. "Dinner tomorrow night, somewhere visible. You ready?" She nodded, though her stomach flipped. "As long as you don't make me wear heels." "Deal." He smiled again, softer this time, and she caught herself smiling back. It was just practice, she told herself. Lines and gestures, a script they'd memorized. But as she headed to her room that night, the photo lingered in her mind. He'd seen her before all this, captured her in a frame she hadn't even known existed, and for the first time she wondered what else he'd seen, what else he might still see. The next night they stepped out together, her hand in his, lights flashing from paparazzi cameras outside the restaurant. She kept her chin up, playing the part, but his thumb brushed her knuckles once, just once, and it didn't feel like acting. She pushed the thought down, deep where it couldn't mess with her head. This was a job. 3 months, 3 million. Nothing more. But as they sat across from each other, the clink of wine glasses drowning out the chatter around them, she caught him watching her again, his notebook open to a page of scribbled light angles. "You're good at this," he said quietly, making it look real. "So are you," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. And that was the problem, wasn't it? It was starting to feel too easy, too right. Elena wasn't sure when the edges of the lie started softening, but it hit her hard 2 weeks later, halfway up a winding trail in Yosemite. Julian had suggested the trip, a photo op for their fake romance, he'd said, something to sell the story to the press and the board. She'd packed her camera, expecting a quick shoot by a waterfall or a posed picnic shot. Instead, she found herself standing on a ridge at dusk, the valley sprawling below in a wash of amber and purple, with Julian beside her, his sleeves rolled up and a quiet grin on his face. "Hold it steady," he said, stepping closer as she adjusted her lens to catch the fading light. His hand brushed hers, guiding the camera, and she didn't pull away. "There. That's the shot." She clicked the shutter, the horizon glowing through the viewfinder. "You're not bad at this," she admitted, lowering the camera to check the frame. "Where'd a tech guy learn to spot light like that?" "My dad," he said, his voice softening. "He'd drag me out to places like this when I was a kid, taught me to see the world through a lens before I ever touched a spreadsheet." He nodded toward the valley. "This is what Kessler Green Tech's about, keeping it alive." Elena glanced at him, caught off guard by the way his eyes lit up. Not the polished CEO, but someone who cared more than he let on. "You're a romantic," she said, half teasing. "Didn't see that coming." "Only when it matters." He met her gaze, and for a second, the wind rustling through the pines was the only sound between them. She looked away first, focusing on her camera bag, but her pulse wouldn't settle. Later, by a stream cutting through the rocks, they sat on a blanket, the air cool and sharp with the scent of pine. She snapped a candid of him tossing a pebble into the water, his laugh breaking the stillness. "Hey, no sneaking shots," he protested, splashing her with a flick of his hand. She yelped, swatting him back, water dripping down her arm. "You're awful," she said, but she was laughing too, the kind of laugh that snuck up on her and left her breathless. He grinned, leaning back on his elbows, and she caught herself staring, his damp shirt clinging to his shoulders. The easy way he sprawled out like this was home. She shook it off, busying herself with her camera, but the moment stuck. That night, under a sky blazing with stars, they lay side by side on the blanket, the campfire reduced to embers. "Ever shot the Milky Way?" he asked, his voice low. "Once," she said. "Takes patience." "You?" "Never got it right." He turned his head, his profile sharp against the dark. "Show me sometime?" Her breath hitched. "Maybe." His hand found hers then, fingers threading through hers longer than their script ever called for. She didn't pull away, not right away, and when she finally did, it was because her heart was pounding too loud to ignore. Back in San Francisco, the real test came at a company fundraiser. Black ties, champagne flutes, chandeliers dripping light over a crowd of suits and gowns. Alina wore a simple navy dress, nothing flashy, but it hugged her in a way that made her feel bold. Julian stayed close, his hand on her lower back as they worked the room, charming investors with their practiced story. She was getting good at it, smiling just right, leaning into him like it was natural, too natural maybe. Vanessa cornered them near the bar, her red lipstick stark against her calculating smile. "You two are adorable," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Tell me, Alina, what made you fall for my cousin? His charm? His bank account?" The room seemed to hush, eyes turning their way. Elena's grip tightened on her glass, but she kept her voice steady. "His spirit," she said, the words spilling out before she could overthink them. "Julian's got this freedom about him. He sees the world like it's worth saving. That's what got me." Vanessa's smirk faltered, just for a second before she recovered. "Poetic. You should write greeting cards." She sauntered off, but the weight of her stare lingered. Julian leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "Nice save. You almost had me believing it." She forced a smile, sipping her drink to hide the flush creeping up her neck. "All part of the gig, right?" He didn't answer right away, just watched her with those hazel eyes that saw too much. Later, as they stepped onto the balcony for air, the city glittering below, he spoke again. "You're good at this, you know, making it feel real." "So are you," she said, her voice quieter now. The breeze tugged at her hair and he reached out, tucking a strand behind her ear. His fingers lingered and she froze, caught between wanting to lean in and wanting to run. "Julian, you make me forget," he said, so soft she almost missed it, "that this is just a role." Her chest tightened. "Don't say that." She stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself. "We can't. This isn't real." "Isn't it?" His voice was gentle, but there was a challenge in it, a question she didn't want to answer. He took a step closer, and she could smell the cedar in his cologne, feel the heat of him even with the space between them. "Elena, I don't." She turned away, her hands trembling. "We've got a deal. 3 months. That's it." He nodded, slow and deliberate, but his eyes didn't leave hers. "If that's what you want." "It is," she lied, the words tasting bitter. She walked back inside, the chatter of the party swallowing her up, but her mind stayed on that balcony, on the way his touch had burned, on the way her heart had whispered something she couldn't let herself hear. The next morning she found a note slipped under her door, written in his messy scrawl, "Thanks for Yosemite, best shot I never took." She folded it into her camera bag, telling herself it didn't mean anything. But as she packed for their next date, her fingers brushed the note again, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the lens was turning, focusing on something she hadn't meant to capture. Vanessa's voice echoed in her head, sharp and taunting. "What made you fall for him?" She'd answered on instinct, but now, alone in the guest suite, she replayed it. His spirit, his freedom, the way he saw the world. It wasn't supposed to be true. Not like this. She grabbed her camera, flipping through the Yosemite shots on the tiny screen. There he was, laughing by the stream, the sun catching the gold in his eyes. Her finger hovered over the delete button, but she couldn't press it. 3 months, she reminded herself. A paycheck, a lifeline. But as she stared at that photo, the lie felt flimsier than ever, and the truth, whatever it was starting to bleed through the frame. Elena thought she'd gotten the hang of the lie. 3 weeks in, she could smile for the cameras, laugh at Julian's quiet jokes, let his hand rest on hers without flinching. It was a rhythm, a dance they'd perfected. But that rhythm shattered on a Tuesday afternoon when a courier dropped off a manila envelope at the penthouse, her name scrawled in sharp red ink. She tore it open in the guest suite, her fingers unsteady. Inside was a stack of papers, bank statements, emails, screenshots. Her breath caught as she skimmed the first page, a record of a $50,000 grant to Lose Natural from an anonymous fund, dated over a year ago. She'd assumed it was dumb luck back then, a lifeline that kept her studio afloat when she was one late rent check from closing. But the next document tied it to Kessler Green Tech, a discreet donation approved by Julian himself. Her hands shook as she flipped through more. Screenshots of her Instagram posts, her captions about Mateo's hospital visits, her late-night rants about chasing light in a world that kept going dark. There were notes in the margins. Julian's handwriting, she'd recognize it anywhere. Circling dates, underlining phrases like, "She's resilient," and "sees what others miss." The final page was a photo of her at the Portland Expo, the same blurry shot he'd shown her, but with a timestamp, 6 months before their deal. The room spun. He hadn't just stumbled into her life. He'd been watching her, studying her, long before that lawyer's call. She grabbed the envelope and stormed out, her boots echoing on the hardwood as she headed for his office. Julian was at his desk when she burst in, papers scattered around him like fallen leaves. He looked up, startled, his tie loosened and a pen still in hand. "Elena, what's?" She slammed the stack down in front of him, her voice trembling with fury. "Explain this." He glanced at the papers, his face paling as recognition hit. "Where did you get these?" "Does it matter?" She jabbed a finger at the grant document. "You funded my studio a year ago. You've been digging into my life, my posts, my brother, everything. This wasn't some random mix-up with your dad's will, was it? You picked me, planned this." Julian stood, slow and deliberate, like he was approaching a skittish animal. "Elena, let me..." "No," she cut him off, stepping back. "You don't get to talk your way out of this. You knew about Mateo's surgery, my debt, all of it. You chose me because I was desperate enough to say yes. How long have you been playing me?" "It's not like that." His voice was low, strained, but she didn't care. She couldn't hear past the betrayal roaring in her ears. "Then what's it like?" She flung the expo photo at him, watching it flutter to the floor. "You took this months ago. You've been..." "What, stalking me? Building some perfect little puppet for your game?" He flinched, his jaw tightening. "I wasn't stalking you. I followed your work. I saw your posts. Yeah, everyone does. You're public online, and when I saw you at Portland, I couldn't forget you." So you engineered this whole thing? Her laugh was hollow, bitter. The lawyer, the will, the "I need you" speech, all of it tailored to pull me in? No. He stepped closer, his hands raised like he wanted to reach for her but didn't dare. The will mix-up was real. My father's assistant screwed up the records. Your name got flagged by accident. But when I looked into it, when I realized it was you, I saw a chance. A chance for what? She snapped. To manipulate me? To trust you? His eyes locked on hers, pleading. I'd been watching your work for months, Elena, not just the photos. The way you fought for your studio, for Mateo. I knew you were real, not some gold digger who'd sell me out. And when this happened, I thought, maybe it was fate. Fate? She shook her head, tears burning behind her eyes. You don't get to call it that. You lied to me, Julian. You made me think I had a choice, but you'd already set the board before I even sat down. I didn't lie, he said, his voice cracking. I omitted stupidly, yeah, but everything after that? Yosemite, the fundraiser, every moment we've had? That was real. I didn't plan to feel this way. Feel what? She crossed her arms, her nails digging into her palms. Guilty? Pity? No. He closed the distance, his gaze intense, unguarded. You know what I mean. You feel it too. I've seen it in your eyes. She wanted to scream that he was wrong, that she hadn't felt her heart twist every time he smiled, hadn't memorized the way his laugh sounded by that stream. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she turned away, her chest heaving. I'm not your pawn, Julian. I'm not some story you get to write. I never thought you were. His voice softened, almost breaking. I'm sorry I didn't tell you everything. But what's between us now, it's not a script. It hasn't been for a while. She grabbed her bag, the papers still scattered on his desk. I need to think, alone. She headed for the door, her boots loud against the silence, but his voice stopped her cold. Vanessa sent those, didn't she? He asked, quiet but certain. She's trying to break us. Elena paused, her hand on the knob. Maybe she already has. She didn't look back as she left, the elevator ride down a blur of steel and glass. Outside, the San Francisco air hit her like a slap. Cool, sharp, real. She walked, aimless, the envelope crumpled in her fist. Back at the penthouse, she locked herself in the guest suite, staring at the photos on her camera. Yosemite glowed on the screen, Julian by the stream, his grin unguarded. She'd caught him mid-laugh, light dancing in his eyes, and now it felt like a lie. Or did it? Her mind raced, replaying his words, his touch, the way he'd looked at her like she was more than a means to an end. But those papers, those damn papers, told a different story. He'd known her weaknesses, played them like a pro. She thought of Mateo, the surgery she'd scheduled next month with Julian's money, the studio she'd fought to keep. Was it all just bait? Or was there truth buried in the mess he'd made? She sank onto the bed, the city lights blinking through the window. 3 months, she'd told herself. A deal, a paycheck. But now, with her heart tangled up and the ground shifting beneath her, she wasn't sure what she was running from or toward. All she knew was that the lens had flipped and the picture she'd trusted was starting to look like someone else's shot. Elena took a red-eye back to Seattle that night, the hum of the plane drowning out the chaos in her head. She'd left the penthouse in a rush, camera bag slung over her shoulder, the envelope of papers stuffed inside, her phone off to avoid Julian's texts. The city lights faded below her and she pressed her forehead against the cold window, trying to piece herself back together. She wasn't sure who she was angrier at, him for the half-truths or herself for letting her guard down. Back home, the apartment smelled of stale coffee and Mateo's cheap cologne. He was asleep on the couch, a textbook open across his chest, his breathing steady for once. She dropped her bag and sank into a chair, watching him. The surgery was set for next month. Julian's money had made that possible. She hated how tangled it all felt now, how every good thing came with a shadow. Her phone buzzed as she powered it on. Missed calls, a string of messages from Julian. "I'm sorry. Please let me explain. I never meant to hurt you." She deleted them without replying, but her thumb hovered over the last one. "I'll be at the gala Friday. If you're there, we can talk. If not, I'll let you go." She tossed the phone aside, her chest tight. Friday was 3 days away. The Kessler Green Tech Winter Gala, their grand finale. She'd planned to be on his arm, smiling for the cameras, sealing the deal. Now the thought made her stomach churn. Matteo stirred, blinking awake. "Elle? You're back early." His voice was groggy, but his eyes sharpened when he saw her face. "What happened?" She forced a smile, shaky at the edges. "Just work stuff. How are you feeling?" "Better than you look." He sat up, brushing hair from his forehead. "Spill it, sis. You're a mess." So she did. The whole story poured out, the fake engagement, the money, Yosemite, the envelope from Vanessa. Matteo listened, his brow furrowing deeper with every word. When she finished, he leaned back, whistling low. "Damn, that's some next-level drama." "Tell me about it," she muttered, rubbing her temples. "I don't know what to do, Teo. He lied, or didn't tell me everything, and I feel like an idiot for trusting him." Matteo studied her, quieter than usual. "You're not an idiot. You're just you. You see the good in people, even when they screw up. Question is, do you think he's worth it?" "Worth what?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Fighting for," he shrugged, "simple as that. You've spent your life chasing light, Elle. Maybe he's part of it. Messy, yeah, but real." She didn't answer, but his words stuck, burrowing deep. For 2 days she threw herself into work, editing old shoots, dodging calls from Julian's team. She tried to erase him, his laugh by the stream, the way he'd adjusted her lens, the note about Yosemite. But every photo she touched reminded her of him, his eye for detail, his quiet passion. She hated it. She missed it. Friday morning, Matteo found her staring at the navy dress from the fundraiser laid out on her bed. "You're going?" he said, not a question. "I don't know," she whispered. "What if it's all fake?" "What if it's not?" He squeezed her shoulder, his grin lopsided. "You taught me to read the shadows, Elle. Go see what's in his." She landed in San Francisco that afternoon, the dress tucked in her bag, her heart a tangled mess. The gala was at a waterfront museum, all glass and steel glowing against the night. She slipped in through a side door, avoiding the red carpet chaos, flashing cameras, clinking glasses, voices buzzing with gossip. The navy dress hugged her like armor, but she felt exposed, raw. Inside, she spotted Vanessa first, her red gown cutting through the crowd as she argued with a board member near the stage. Then Julian's aunt, Clara, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes, watching from a corner with a knowing smile. But Julian, he wasn't in the main hall. Clara caught her gaze and nodded toward the east wing. "He's prepping his speech. Go." Elena's feet moved before her brain caught up, weaving through marble corridors lined with ocean-themed art. She heard his voice before she saw him, low and steady, drifting from an open room. "My father built this company on a promise to leave the world greener, brighter. I've tried to honor that, but I've made mistakes." She stepped inside. He stood alone, facing a window, a crumpled speech in his hand. He didn't turn, just kept talking like he was rehearsing for ghosts. "The biggest was letting someone I care about walk away. This started as a plan, a contract, but it turned into something I can't let go of. Not the company, her." Her throat tightened. Julian. He spun around, his eyes widening. He looked wrecked, tie askew, hair mussed, shadows under his eyes. Elena? I had to know, she said, her voice trembling. About the grant, the studio. Did you set me up from the start? No. He crossed the room, stopping short of touching her. I funded your studio a year ago, anonymously, because I loved your work. I didn't know you'd need surgery money, didn't plan the will mix-up. That was chaos, not a setup. But when it happened, I saw you, really saw you, and I couldn't let it go. So you used me, she said, the words sharp. I trusted you, his voice broke. I should have told you everything. Portland, the grant, how long I'd admired you. But I didn't want you to feel trapped. I wanted you to choose me, not the deal. She shook her head, tears welling up. How do I believe you now? He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. Her Instagram post from last year, a shot of Mateo laughing in the rain, captioned, "Chasing light through the storm." His handwriting scrawled across it, "She's the real thing." This is why, he said. Not your debt, not your studio. You. Her breath hitched. She took the paper, her fingers brushing his, and the warmth of him cracked something open inside her. I was so scared it wasn't real, she whispered, that I was just convenient. You were never convenient. He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. You were the shot I didn't know I needed until it was right in front of me. The gala's fume filtered through the walls. Laughter, music, the world spinning on. But here, it was just them. The air thick with what they hadn't said. What happens now? She asked. Vanessa, the board. Your cousin's out there waiting to tear this apart. I don't care. His hand cupped her cheek, tentative, like he was afraid she'd pull away. I'll walk away from it all if I have to. I just need you. Elena Castillo, the woman who sees light where I see shadows. She leaned into his touch, her walls crumbling. I don't want you to lose everything. Then stay with me, he said, his voice raw. Not for the deal, not for the cameras, for us. She closed her eyes, Mateo's words echoing. Go see what's in his. When she opened them, she saw it, him, stripped bare. No script, no pretense. Okay, she said, soft but sure. No more lies. Just us. He kissed her then, not the careful pecks they'd rehearsed, but something fierce and real, like he'd been holding it back too long. She kissed him back, her hands tangling in his hair, the world fading to a blur of light and heat. Later, on the gala stage, he tossed his speech aside. I was supposed to talk about legacy, he told the crowd, his arm around her. But tonight's about truth. This woman changed everything, not because of a contract, but because she showed me what matters. Vanessa's glare burned from the sidelines, but the board applauded, swept up in the moment. After, they slipped outside, the bay shimmering under the stars. He handed her his camera. Hers now, he said, and she snapped a shot of them, his arm around her, her head on his shoulder. No filters, no staging, just them, messy and true, the frame wide open for whatever came next.